Hey everybody, thanks for being here. I'd like to apologize for preventing you from watching the rest of War Games. If you're anything like me, you'd probably rather watch the rest of that movie than listen to this talk. I'm glad that was the intro to this talk. There's actually a lesson that ties in from my talk to War Games. But my journey in cybersecurity started when I was a product manager at a medical device company, and I was in a meeting with representatives from a high-level hospital who in the last 5 minutes of a 4-hour meeting said, oh, by the way, we're treating a foreign dignitary for prostate cancer, and we're concerned that the Chinese government might attempt to assassinate this individual by using a cybersecurity vulnerability in a medical device. So we penetration tested all of the medical devices we use, and here's a bunch of bugs, go fix them. And there's actually a non-HIPAA compliant version of that story that I can tell you later if you like. But I'd never thought about cybersecurity in a medical device actually having a patient safety impact. I had only ever thought of cybersecurity in medical devices around the data privacy aspect of things, HIPAA compliance. So I started to look into the field and realized that at least in 2014, basically no medical devices had any cybersecurity features built into them at all. And that's a big problem because I think within the next 15 years, the vast majority of medical devices will be connected to the general internet, not just the hospital network, but the internet at large. And some of the medical devices that manufacturers here build are things like scalpels. I've even seen electronic scalpels that are Bluetooth enabled. I have no idea why your scalpel would need to be Bluetooth enabled, but it actually does exist. Healthcare is moving out of the hospital and into the home. It's very expensive to treat patients at the hospital, so we want to do as much as we can with patients while they are in their home, which means the devices that these physicians use need to have internet connectivity. So that's one big driver of this. Another big driver is the shift in healthcare from paying for service to paying for performance. I don't know if you saw this article a couple weeks ago. The CEO of Medtronic said that they are investigating shifting to a fee for success model for their medical devices. So they only get paid if their devices actually work the way that they're supposed to. I'm sort of fascinated to see how they can actually measure performance and outcomes here, but it probably has something to do with some of these devices being connected to the internet and capturing usage data from out in the field. So if you have a medical device and you want it to connect to the internet, there's a couple ways to do that. The device can have a Wi-Fi chip in it, and then your grandmother can have to configure the device to talk to Wi-Fi, which is a huge pain. You can put a cellular chip in it, so the device can talk directly to a cellular gateway, and that's a great solution for some devices, but is relatively expensive. Or you can use basically the router that's in your pocket, your iPhone, and connect to that via Bluetooth. So we're seeing a huge number of medical devices using Bluetooth to connect to the internet via a cell phone or some other hub, and there are problems with that. Bluetooth is sort of a notoriously difficult protocol to secure, but there are lots and lots of devices using it. So my company, MedCrypt, we build cybersecurity software for medical device vendors, and in order to illustrate this problem, we hacked a medical device. But no, we did not partner with a hedge fund and short the stock and then go on Bloomberg. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that story. In 2016, a cybersecurity research firm found some vulnerabilities in a pacemaker, and rather than reporting them to the FDA, they partnered with a hedge fund. They shorted the stock of the manufacturer, and then the CEO of the hedge fund went on Bloomberg talking about how terrible this vulnerability is and how the device is going to get pulled off the market for 2 years and the stock's going to plummet. And there were some pretty serious ramifications to that. But we didn't do that, right? We were working with a device company. We knew the executives well. We had an NDA. We said, hey, can we poke around in this thing and see if we can show you why Bluetooth security really is a concern? And they said, sure. So this device had a pretty common architecture. So there was a measurement device, which in this case measured patient vital signs like heart rate and a couple of others. It sent that data over a protocol called Bluetooth Low Energy to a base station, which was not a phone. It was just a tiny little Wi-Fi router looking thing that they had white labeled from some other manufacturer that then sent data to their cloud application via Wi-Fi, and then the data went from the cloud app to the user's cell phone so the user could see the vital signs of the patient in question. They were using something called Bluetooth advertising, which is one of many ways to send data over Bluetooth, version 4.0 of the Bluetooth protocol, which is important, remember the 4.0 part, and then sends the data to the, I went through all this. All right. So there are a couple of security issues with this. First, the communication from the base station to the cloud had some issues. The data maybe wasn't encrypted the way that it should be. They weren't checking to make sure that the data hadn't been manipulated in transit. But the focus of today's talk is around the actual Bluetooth vulnerabilities themselves. So Bluetooth 4.0 has a vulnerability where if somebody's in the room, the first time you pair these devices, they can basically read any data that the devices communicate later on. And unfortunately, the only way to address that vulnerability through the Bluetooth protocol is to upgrade to version 4.2, which requires a hardware upgrade. So it's a huge, huge issue that we're hoping to help fix with software. So in order to show you this vulnerability and talk about some of the impacts and how it might impact devices that you're working on, we basically built a replica of this device so that we wouldn't have to show the device itself, right? We don't want to talk about the specific device in question. We built a replica of this device where we have 2 computers, 2 small Raspberry Pis, which are very inexpensive Linux-based computers, one that represented the heart rate monitor, and one that represented the user interface showing the user what was going on. And then we had a third Raspberry Pi which acted as the bad guy in between and was attempting to manipulate the data in between those 2. So let me show you a quick video demo of this. So on the left here, we've got a screen, a user interface that shows the actual data on the measurement device. The heart rate is 83 beats per minute, and that data gets sent to the user interface, which is this other screen on the right. And what you would expect is if something bad happened to the patient, if the monitor was disconnected, the battery died, the patient's heart stopped, you would get an alert on the right that says, hey, something bad is going on here. That's the intended outcome. But what we were able to do is to put a third Raspberry Pi in the room, which basically listened to all of the data that heart rate monitor was advertising, record all of this data, and store it so that when something bad happens to the patient, this hacker in the middle starts rebroadcasting that data so that the phone doesn't know any better. It thinks that the data it's receiving is valid data from the patient, but in fact, the patient may be dead. This could be a really big issue if this was a vital sign monitor and the patient's heart stopped and somebody wasn't able to intervene, if it was a glucose monitor and there were erroneous glucose measurements being sent. So this was the demonstration that we did for the medical device vendor saying, hey, right now with your device, somebody can get in between these 2 endpoints and send false data and make everything look like, make it look like the patient is fine when they are in fact not fine, or make it look like the patient is ill when they are in fact not ill. And I sort of thought that once we showed this particular vulnerability, the manufacturer would just throw their wallet at us and say, yes, please help us fix this issue. But in fact, they just said, yeah, we thought something like that was probably possible. And then there was just silence. And I said, really? That's it? Nobody really is concerned about this? And then the second layer of that story, I gave a similar presentation to this one to a group of medical device company cybersecurity representatives that included some people from the FDA, and gave this presentation and said, how many of you in the room think this is a really big issue? If your medical device displayed this behavior, how many of you would be concerned? And everyone in the room, with the exception of one person, including the representative from the FDA, raised their hand and said, this is a really, really big issue that needs to be addressed. So there are some technical reasons for this particular vulnerability. So they were using something called Bluetooth advertising and not pairing. How many of you in the audience in any way deal with devices that use Bluetooth? Would that be relevant? Okay, so the technical details might be relevant here. So Bluetooth advertising was developed so that a user could walk into somewhere like the Apple Store, and the Apple Store would magically know that you're there and send you an alert and say, hey, you should go over to this aisle, there's a sale on whatever. It doesn't require pairing, which means it's easier to use, but it's less secure because the endpoints don't necessarily know who each endpoint is. Second, the data that was being sent between these devices was being sent in plain text. So the piece of hardware we used to do this vulnerability is called an Ubertooth one. It's $100. It was on Amazon. You plug it into your computer. It helps you sniff Bluetooth packets. My background is in the clinical functionality of the medical devices, not software development itself. So when my partners and I decided to do this project, they said, hey, rather than one of us who is a software expert doing this project, why don't we have you, a non-software expert, do the project, and if you can hack it, we'll know that it's really bad. So it took me about a week to do this project. Using the Ubertooth one and the very limited knowledge of the command line that I have, I was able to do the hack. And then I was able to notice certain patterns in the data that I was seeing from the Ubertooth one, and I put them in a spreadsheet and figured out that I could instantly convert the numbers that I was seeing in the Bluetooth packets into the heart rate values. So I could actually see what the heart rate values were, and then I could change the heart rate value from 80 to 100 because the data was just being sent in plain text. There was no encryption being used. There was no obfuscation. So that's something that could have been done better. Bluetooth version 4.0 is inherently insecure. I mentioned that earlier. If an attacker is in the room, they can sort of infer the encryption keys that Bluetooth is using and therefore use those keys going forward to decrypt data in a way that they shouldn't. So if you use Bluetooth version 4.2, that issue has been fixed. But at some point in the future, there may be an issue with 4.2 or with 5.0. And if that issue requires a hardware upgrade to change, that's a really, really big problem. And then finally, they didn't cryptographically sign the data. So cryptographic signatures, it's a way to validate that data actually came from a trusted source and hasn't been manipulated in transit. So in this case, we were able to do what's called a replay attack, where we sent old data to the device, and the device just said, hey, this looks like it's in the right format, so we will assume that the data is valid, rather than doing a mathematical check to ensure that the data came from a trusted source. So some ways to fix this. In this case, we recommended that they use Bluetooth version 4.2 bonding instead of advertising. Ideally, they would assign unique encryption keys to every endpoint. So essentially, this means two things. Number one, having a pair of encryption keys on the device that the device can use to secure the data before it is sent. But number two, making sure that each device that is manufactured has a unique pair of keys. So I mentioned earlier in my talk this cybersecurity research firm that found a vulnerability in a pacemaker and partnered with a hedge fund. One of the vulnerabilities they found is that every device that was manufactured had encryption keys, but they had the same encryption keys. So if you went into a device and you hacked it and you figured out the key, you could then talk to any future device made by this manufacturer of the same model. So it is good practice to put unique keys on every one of these devices. You want to encrypt the data on the monitor before it is transmitted, ideally in the application layer. You want to sign that data cryptographically. Finally, you want to check the data when it's received at the base station to make sure that the cryptographic signature looks good, that nobody has manipulated this data, and that it came from a trusted source. But the root cause here, if you ask whatever the quality system thing is, where you ask like 7 whys to get to the root cause of the issue, the root cause of the cybersecurity issue in medical devices, and specifically in Bluetooth-enabled medical devices, it's not that sufficient technology doesn't exist to address these security problems. These really are symptoms of structural issues, procedural issues inside organizations that actually build these devices. And being a former product manager at a medical device vendor, I'm familiar with some of these. So the first is, you've got an engineer that has some cool idea, and in spare time, they put together a prototype of something that could be a product, and management says, hey, that looks really cool, you should add these couple of features. And they add those couple of features, and next thing you know, this prototype has become a minimum viable product. It's been deployed at a couple of customers, and then all of a sudden it goes for some sort of regulatory review, and at no point during prototyping a product does an engineer say, hey, I should spend a couple of weeks here securing all of this data. That's not a fun thing to do as an engineer, generally doesn't get done in minimum viable products. Second, if the device was developed in the traditional sort of requirements gathering development process, engineers that build medical devices essentially have an infinite number of features that their bosses want to see implemented, right? This device should adjust the patient's heart rate, and it should also communicate data wirelessly, and if you have time, it should also facilitate time travel and anti-gravity. All right, we probably won't get to those last two. So you've got an infinite number of feature requests, you've got a finite number of engineers, and some features just fall off the roadmap. And unfortunately, historically, a lot of times those features have been cybersecurity related. Time to launch, there's almost always some person, usually in marketing, that has decided, hey, we're going to launch this at CES next year, or we're going to launch this at whatever the big trade show is, and that's 18 months away, and everyone says, yeah, sure, there's no problem, we'll get that done before 18 months. Next thing you know, it's like 6 weeks before the show starts, and the prototype that you have isn't working properly, and you need to fix all these other things. You never get to the security stuff. Finally, there's this question that we get of why would anybody actually want to hack a medical device? And I don't know if this question is as relevant as it was when we first started our company in 2015, but we used to talk to medical device vendors about securing a device, and they'd say, who would want to hack this? There's no credit card data, there's no PHI on this particular device, so nobody would want to hack it. Well, the War Games movie intro is a great example of why somebody would want to hack something. I don't know, you're a stupid 17-year-old kid, and they're interested in figuring out how something works, and they start poking around in it. There doesn't always need to be a financial motive for a hacker or an attacker to do something bad. For example, does anybody know what this is a picture of? What's that? A security screw. I am fascinated by this thing. So on the way here in the Newark airport, I took a picture of the divider between these stalls in the men's bathroom. And you'll notice that the screw that holds the stalls together is not a Phillips head screw, and it's not a flathead screw, it's a security screw. So apparently at some point in time, so many people were taking the screws out of the dividers in bathrooms to be destructive that they had to invent a new kind of screw to prevent this thing from happening. So imagine the meeting at the Newark airport where somebody says, we've got this huge problem, people are taking apart all of our bathrooms. And someone's like, well, why would they actually do that? I don't know, but it's happening, it's rampant. We need to spend 10 cents extra per screw to put in these security screws. Somehow this got approved, right? This is a big enough issue that an entire industry of security screws exists because people are trying to take apart bathroom stalls. There's no financial motive there, there's no PHI there, there's no financial gain. People are just destructive. So as a medical device developer and manufacturer, we need to understand that the motivations to hack things are not always financial. Sometimes you want to be destructive, sometimes you want to play international thermonuclear war, or whatever that was called. Another thing that we heard about the vital sign monitor vulnerability that we demonstrated was, well, this isn't really a big deal because it would require physical proximity, right? Some cybersecurity vulnerabilities are exploitable over the internet, and that's very, very bad because you can do something bad from far away. Bluetooth vulnerabilities generally require being within 30 to 100 feet of the person that you are that you're trying to the device that you're trying to hack. But the idea that this isn't a big deal because it requires physical proximity does not sit well specifically with the FDA. So last year, the FDA facilitated the first cybersecurity-related recall of an implantable Class 3 medical device. They recalled 500,000 Abbott, formerly St. Jude pacemakers because they had a vulnerability that needed to be, that could only be exploited locally. And it's actually a fascinating story. How many of you have heard this story? All right, so this is a fascinating story because this is the same device that those hackers that partnered with the hedge fund were poking into and found an issue with. So the FDA finally says, okay, you have to recall this thing. So the manufacturer develops a software update for this pacemaker and says, okay, we're doing a voluntary recall. If you have one of these devices, you should talk to your physician about whether or not you should receive this firmware update. And the firmware update is done over the air through the patient's chest, didn't require surgery. But every time you adjust the software on a device that's maintaining a patient's life, there's a very tiny chance something goes wrong and the patient could be harmed, right? If you do this a trillion times, a couple of patients are going to die as a result. So the medical device manufacturer said it's up to the cardiologist to decide if the risk-reward ratio is such that this upgrade should be done. And a lot of cardiologists came back and said, I'm not doing a software upgrade for a cybersecurity vulnerability. Like, I don't have Dick Cheney as my patient. It's some guy's grandma who's going to hack this grandma's pacemaker. But the FDA came out with wording that was strangely specific, in which they said to cardiologists and physicians making this decision, do not underestimate the probability of a patient being harmed as a result of this particular vulnerability. And that wording sounded to me like maybe the government was aware of some sort of desire to use these sorts of vulnerabilities to harm patients. So the notion that you need physical proximity, that's not good enough. The FDA wants to see devices more secure than that. So a couple of takeaways. Number one, security is not a distraction from your business as a medical device developer or manufacturer. It's imperative to the success of the business. If you are successful enough to sell 500,000 pacemakers and then they get recalled for a cybersecurity vulnerability, that's a big problem. So cybersecurity should be looked at as a business enabler. It enables you to lose fewer sales, it enables you to have fewer recalls, to have better clinical functionality, and maybe even to release clinical functions that you'd be afraid to do if you didn't have a good cybersecurity posture. Second, I hear a lot of medical device vendors saying, we can't do software updates regularly. The FDA regulatory process is difficult, so we're going to do updates every 2 years. Well, you know what? If your device connects to the internet, you're now an internet company. And there's some things that internet companies do. They deliver products continuously, right? If there's a bug in Netflix, they fix that like any second, because if I can't watch whatever, I'm going to be really upset. They fix these problems immediately. Second, software developers that build software for the internet, they generally only build the code that is unique to their particular core competency. Almost every other piece of a technology stack is some open source technology, right? Twitter was built initially entirely with open source components. Google has gotten to the point where a lot of their tools are run at such a scale that they need to not use the generally available open source things, but build some new open source tools. But a lot of medical device vendors are hesitant to use open source software for some reason, right? It doesn't sound like something that would fit into a quality program in a highly regulated environment. But in fact, from a cybersecurity perspective, the open source tools that are used by tens of thousands of developers in millions of cases per day, those are the ones that have been tested and we know to be as secure as practical. So we really, as an industry, need to embrace open source software, specifically around cybersecurity. Second, and these two are important, you need to be proactively looking for vulnerabilities out on the internet, not waiting for some hacker to call you and tell you there's a problem. And when a hacker calls you and tells you there's a problem, you don't sue them. You work with them to fix the problem, make sure that you handle it responsibly, and then let them talk about the research that they've done after the problem has been fixed. Takeaway number 3, this guy doesn't care about certifications. Every time I go to a healthcare-specific cybersecurity conference, I hear about all of these different certifications and quality systems, and essentially it boils down to Word documents that have lists of vulnerabilities and things that people do. And that's great. Those processes are important. The certifications are great. But unless those processes result in real security features being built into devices, they're still going to be vulnerable. And this guy doesn't care about your ISO certification. So MedCrypt, quick blurb. So we're a software company. We have a software product that gets built into medical devices. It gets baked right into the device. We work with the device developers when they're building a product from scratch or whether they're updating it. We secure data when it's most vulnerable, when it's being communicated between these various endpoints. We monitor the devices once they're out in the field looking for suspicious behavior. And we built our feature set directly around the FDA's guidelines. So final thought, I get this question a lot. Has this ever happened? Has anybody ever died as a result of a hack? And I even have investors tell me, until somebody dies as a result of one of these cybersecurity attacks, nobody's going to care, nobody's going to spend money on this. And we've always felt that these devices aren't designed in such a way that if there was a hack, we would even know it. There was an article put out by Scripps Healthcare last year that said when they started monitoring their devices for their network, their hospital network for intrusion, they found they were getting 600,000 attempts to penetrate their network per month. And a lot of those are just general bots out there on the internet doing bad things, but some of those are targeted attacks. We don't know if these devices are under attack because they don't currently have functionality that would allow us to know if there was an attack. But Vanderbilt University, I believe, put out a report last week or the week prior that looked at mortality rates from common clinical conditions, in this case heart attacks, at a specific hospital before that hospital suffered a cybersecurity breach and after the hospital suffered a cybersecurity breach. And they found out that you were about 1% more likely to die from a heart attack if the hospital you're visiting had a cybersecurity breach in the last year. And that was sort of fascinating to me because it's, there's a lot of debate about the methodology of the report and how useful that information is. But if you present at a hospital and you have a stroke, my understanding is there's a specific imaging technique that needs to be performed to figure out what kind of stroke you're having. And if that device is down because there's a ransomware event or the device has fallen victim to some other sort of cybersecurity breach, your probability of making it through that stroke is lower. So I think in the next 18 months, we will see more and more conclusive evidence that patients have in fact been harmed by cybersecurity breaches in medical devices, even if they weren't specific attacks on Bluetooth functionality, but more general cybersecurity issues. That's it. Thank you.
Not it yet. I want to come to the stage for two reasons. One, I have a question, and another is that, Wharton brothers should stick together. So let's get a nice photo up here.
All right. Send it to, maybe we can pay my student loan bill with that picture.
I don't know about that, but here's a statement leading into a question. I've run a medical device conference for 6 years now. And in about the second year, I had two cybersecurity folks come, and afterward they said, yeah, I think the talk went pretty well, but nobody's come up to me and said, I need to talk to you about this or that or that. Having led the medical devices group for 6 years now, there's never been a cybersecurity conversation that, went viral. Everyone was talking. I get the impression that there's terrific complacency among medical device manufacturers. It's not going to happen to us, or, yeah, IT is taking care of it. I've also heard consultants tell me that, people are saying, I'm only talking about this because I'm trying to scare people into, getting my service or something. I believe, I wouldn't have you on stage if I didn't, but what do you think we need to do as thought leaders in the space to get medical device companies to say, you know what, this is more than an expense, this is vital and a competitive advantage for us to do a better job with cybersecurity? How would you answer us?
So when we first started the company in 2015, we got responses from device vendors that this isn't really a problem, or we have it under control, it's not an issue. Unfortunately, in the last 12 months, specifically the last 6 months, we've seen C-level executives at device vendors take a proactive approach to cybersecurity and saying, as an organization, we need to be prepared around this. Companies like Medtronic, Baxter, have people in product cybersecurity roles. Unfortunately, the people in those roles have only been there for a year or so. These are new roles, so it takes a while to get results in these devices that take years and years to get to market. So I think continuing to have this conversation for researchers to continue looking into the clinical impacts of cybersecurity, such as that Vanderbilt report that I showed, I think we'll continue to implore medical device vendors to take a proactive approach, and it's coming. They're doing it. It's just in my opinion, the efforts that they have taken have not yet made it to the field. Right? We're still a year or more out from the devices that have been designed with cybersecurity in mind really hitting the hospitals.
If you're watching this in TV land at some later date, I implore you, for my safety and my children's safety, get in touch with Mike or someone who works in cybersecurity, because this is not an issue that's going to go away. It may not have affected you yet, but it will affect us as an industry. Mike Kijewski, thank you very, very much for talking with us today.
Thanks.
Let's hear it from Mike.